In this lecture, we're going to discuss forestry and the importance of our forests. The title slide here shows a satellite image of the border between Haiti on the left and the Dominican Republic on the right. And it's pretty clear to see which of the two countries has maintained its forests sustainably. Haiti went through a period of intense deforestation and has not had those forests grow back, and they are suffering a number of consequences as a result of that, including soil erosion, poor water quality, inability to grow food. So forestry and how we treat our forests is a very, very important science and an important part of this course. So in this lecture, we're going to discuss forests. We'll take a look at their benefits and their structure and what an old forest looks like and what a new forest looks like. We'll talk about that. We'll look at the value of forests, including their ecosystem services. We'll look at the various threats to forests today. And then we'll take a look at logging methods and also sustainable forestry. We'll wrap up the lecture by taking a look at forest fires and their importance to forests and why they may be increasing in intensity lately. So let's start by discussing forests here. So forests are designed to have a particular structure, which includes the spatial arrangement of the trees, what type of vegetation is growing. And we notice that there is not just a two-dimensional structure where we look at the square footage and size of a forest, but there's a three-dimensional structure with many layers to a forest as we move away from the ground. Now, the forest floor is the lowest level and contains a lot of leaf litter and plant material. You'll often see shade-tolerant plants like ferns growing here and little saplings. This is where you're going to have your soil layer, of course. So forests will want to have good development of the A horizon and the B horizon, the subsoil as well, because of the trees having deep roots. So the forest floor is our lowest structure. Then above that we have the understory, which includes trees and shrubs that are adapted again for shade. Why shade? Well, because there's the dominant trees or the older trees that are above them, shielding the light, almost serving as umbrellas. These trees within the understory will tend to grow rapidly when they do see room for them to grow. If there isn't enough light, they won't grow very fast. So the understory is full of a lot of competition and fast-growing plants when ready to take advantage of any opportunities to grow taller. Now the canopy includes the dominant trees. These are the trees that have been there for the longest. They have outcompeted the trees from the understory, so they're taller. They're receiving the most light, and they tend to shade everything below, which is why these two bottom layers need to be shade tolerant. The emergent layer is when you may have some innovative trees that are trying to get even more light. So they'll kind of reach up or grow up past the canopy, maybe even trying to establish a new canopy layer through competition. Let's talk about different types of forests, especially in terms of succession. Ecological succession, you may remember, is the progression of forests to what we call a climax hardwood forest, right? So old growth forests, as we see here, these are what we call primary forests. So this is the climax community as a result of ecological succession. They tend to be centuries or even thousands of years old. They have not had significant human disturbance, and they tend to have a high biodiversity, and they're a very diverse ecosystem. So primary forests are sometimes called old growth simply because they have been there for so long. Now, second growth or secondary growth forests have regrown after a disturbance, and they often have a little less structure, maybe a little more uniform structure. So we can see here, these secondary forests have less of a structure than our primary forest, right? So you can see some of the trees are a little more sparse. The canopy layer is not as high because they haven't existed as long. They have been disturbed in the past, and they're slowly but surely growing back to this primary forest. So what we see in this graphic here is basically what happens to trees when they are clear cut, right? So when we have a clear cutting occur, we basically are taking all the large trees out, and we may be left with just a few little shrubs. We may also remove trees for pasture land or for farmland, right? So we really scalp the land of any trees. Then what happens after that is we may have trees that grow back as a tree plantation, right? So we may purposely plant them in rows to try to grow wood for lumber. We may be using the land for agroforestry, where we're growing trees but also crops. Or if we're not using it for anything, we might just want it to grow back into a forest. So this would be the young secondary forest. Maybe this is like 30 years old, and the older secondary forest might be closer to like 60. When these forests are selectively logged, we'll talk about this in a bit, we can see we're going to allow the large trees to maintain that canopy, but we're taking some of the fast-growing understory trees out. So if we take a look at a photograph rather than the diagram, this is what an old growth forest would look like. You can see that the structure is present there with plenty of shade tolerant plants on the ground. We have lots of canopy tree, or excuse me, understory trees that are ready to take advantage of any light coming through. And then you have your mature trees that are making up the canopy layer. In secondary growth, this is looking at a forest that's kind of recovering from a forest fire. So the main trees are still there, but you can see the understory has been burned out, but eventually it will grow back. This is a good example of a tree plantation. The tree's original forest has been removed and supplanted with these rows of trees that will be grown and harvested again, say in 30, 50 years, for their wood to be used in lumber or maybe paper products. Let's now discuss the value of forests. So you remember the term ecosystem services. Well, forests have a number of them that you see listed here. So we have a number of provisioning services, including the provision of timber or lumber. We can acquire food from forests and also fuel, because wood itself is an important fuel, especially in less developed countries. We have regulating services that are going on in forests, such as regulation of climate, clean air, and water filtration, erosion control. So these are the services that the country of Haiti lost when they took out all of their forest, right? They were taking advantage of the provisioning service by taking all the trees out for timber. And of course, they made some quick money off of that. But they failed to see the long-term results of losing this erosion control and water filtration part of the forest, and that's why they're struggling now to grow food. There's also cultural services such as recreation. We can think of hiking and so forth, and also just the idea of being in forests and their important value to us, even in a spiritual sense. And then the supporting services are the formation of soil within forests, the cycling of nutrients, including the carbon cycle, which we can see is highlighted here. Forests in particular store a lot of carbon. So we look at the 3 forests that are pictured here, and they store 61% of the terrestrial carbon that we find in the biosphere, right? So a lot more than deserts, obviously, because there's not many plants there, but way more than grasslands and also shrublands. So forests are important sinks and reservoirs of storing carbon. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because when carbon is stored in wood, that takes it out of the atmosphere. So forests sequester that. And this is why sometimes growing forests and going through the regenerative process of regrowing forests after the collection of that lumber might actually be a help to the climate and climate change. We'll talk about that in just a bit. Let's now focus on the human threats. What are the concerns we have according to human behavior, and like essentially what are the anthropogenic causes of deforestation. And the first, of course, is the expansion of agriculture or farms. Forests are often cleared to make way for agriculture, so this could be slash and burn agriculture that we see in many rainforests. What we see happening a lot in rainforests, especially in other equatorial countries, is the removal of forests, of the rainforest, for the purpose of palm oil. Palm oil, of course, is used in many snacks. It's an interesting product that can be used, but a lot of your cheap snacks will use palm oil because it's easier to grow and cheaper than, say, growing canola oil or some other things. And so we're seeing a lot of pressure being put on the very diverse rainforests in our world being essentially deforested and plowed over to make these rows of palm trees that are used for palm oil. Logging and timber industries, of course, are removing large hardwood trees for the purposes of lumber. So we can see that pictured here. And this also, obviously, we're looking at lumber, and we're also looking at paper products as well. So why recycling paper and wood is very good, because that takes less pressure off of standing forests. Also, urbanization, or the expansion of cities and the development of roadways, leads to a loss of forest trees and also the fragmentation of them. So when you build a road through a forest, that essentially takes a large forest area and cuts it into two smaller forest areas, which, as we learned with the island biogeography effect, reduces species richness and biodiversity overall. Mining needs to clear away the trees to get to the soil that they then dig up to find the areas, the minerals and ore that they're looking for, whether it's coal or gold, whatever it might be. So the excavation sites need to go through a period of tree removal and deforestation, as you can see in this photo. We mentioned that less developed countries rely on wood for a fuel, and so many countries throughout the earth and many people still rely on wood for fuel, basically to heat their homes, to cook their food. And so as we learned in Unit 3, the populations of less developed countries are increasing very, very quickly. That's where most of the human population growth is. And so since there's not a developed infrastructure, they rely on more primitive methods of cooking and heating homes. So harvesting of wood doesn't sound like an individual person may just take a tree or two for themselves for the year. But if the population is growing and there's many more people than there have been in the past, well, then that puts a lot of pressure on forests to provide wood for that purpose. But there's also some natural threats and threats from the environment that, and it's important to recognize here, that are being exacerbated or being made worse because of climate change. So the change in climate, with its rising temperatures and shifting weather patterns and altered water cycle, really are putting pressure on forests. So there's risks of droughts, there's risks of floods and soil erosion. There's also a lot of pests, which we'll talk about. And another thing that occurs is wildfires. So wildfires appear to be much more intense now than they have been in the past. There's a twofold reason for this. One is climate change leading to drier understory, meaning when there's a drought, the understory plants dry out very quickly and can burn with just a simple lightning strike and lead to large fires. But also the way we manage our forests may be ripening these forests for these intense fires. We're going to talk about that in the last part of this lecture. We also see there's many invasive species and diseases that are making their way across some forests. So the mountain pine beetle has received a lot of attention lately because these decimate tree populations, as you can see in this aerial photograph of a pine forest up in Canada. I believe this is in British Columbia, Canada, and you can see the number of trees that are dying simply because of these invasive beetles that bore into the bark. They have no predators, and the changing climate reduces their winter mortality. So they don't die off because the winters are not as extreme as they used to be. That would help to keep them under control. So they survive the winter, and then next year they can just move on to another tree. And so we've been seeing this happen throughout parts of North America. We also have increased natural disasters, such as more intense hurricanes, which lead to more flooding and severe windstorms, which simply damage forests. So there's been a loss of a lot of trees simply because of intense storms. This map shows you the net change of forests over the last 20 years or so. So the data we're looking at is really back to 2005. And so if we take a look here, the areas that are red are the areas where you see the most significant loss of trees. So you'll notice that a lot of the equatorial regions where you have rainforests, such as in Brazil and Indonesia, we see a lot of loss of trees, right? So there's a lot of deforestation going there for slash and burn agriculture, for palm oil plantations, and so forth. There are some areas that have not had much of a change. There's been some loss, say, in areas of Europe and Canada. But interestingly, there is some areas where you have net gain, where there's what we call reforestation, most notably in the United States, in China, India, and Russia. Now, it is important to note that this is only going back to 2005, so the reason this appears to be a net gain of forests is because these countries have already gone through demographic transition, and a lot of their industrialization is a result of deforestation. So, in other words, there was a loss of trees, and now we're trying to regrow those back, trying to get back to where we were. So if we look at the United States, we can see that we have a history of intense deforestation. So this data is now going back to the 1800s. And in the first slide of this animation, you can see there was a lot of virgin or primary growth forests all throughout the United States back in the 1800s. And today there's very little left. And a lot of what's left is protected as part of national parks. So there is a need to regrow forests. And so a lot of the forests we see in the United States are managed secondary growth forests. The areas where we see the most intense deforestation now, as I mentioned, are the tropics. So this is looking at the Amazon rainforest. And so the red areas are where you see slash and burn agriculture occurring. And you can see that over the past 25 years, it has been spreading considerably. So a good portion of the Amazon rainforest has been replaced with agriculture. This is looking at Borneo, another tropical country, and you can see their rainforest is being depleted for two things: oil palm plantation, which you mentioned. This is supplementing our food source, and also pulpwood plantation, which would be used for paper products and stuff. So you can see when we go back to your ecological footprint, what you eat matters to the environment. So that's why there's you get a better score on your ecological footprint if you eat locally sourced food rather than things that might be cheap and have things like palm oil. Also, when you recycle your paper and use recycled paper products, well then that's better because it puts less pressure on these forests that are being harvested for the pulpwood. So how can we do a better job? What are the lessons that the United States and Canada and other countries have learned about sustainable forestry? Well, management of forests is very, very important. We want to have a basically threefold understanding. And remember, so there's three levels to sustainability, considering the environment, the economy, and also social goals. So that goes back to our first lecture in this unit. And so as we do that, we have multiple objectives when we're growing or managing forests. We do still need to produce timber, right? We need to produce timber, lumber for building our infrastructure, and also providing paper and things like that. Also, we want to conserve biodiversity, and we want to restore existing ecosystems, right? And a fourth thing we can put on here is we have to adapt to climate change, right? Forest structure is changing because of that, and that's significant. This goes back to maximum sustainable yield. So what's important is understanding how trees grow. And of course there is, when a forest becomes or hits that climax old growth forest, it has hit its carrying capacity. So the trees aren't really growing that much. So if we are managing a forest to produce timber, it's the key is to manage the forest in such a way that the trees are growing their fastest. This would produce lumber and pulpwood as fast as possible with minimal amounts of environmental impact. So we would still have a forest, but we would be growing the trees very fast. This would have benefits for, say, carbon sequestration from the atmosphere, right? If the trees are always growing at their fastest, that means they are pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at a faster rate as well. And so when we look at forestry management, this is the cycle that we see. So and this is talking specifically about a forest that is managed for the purpose of producing timber. So we can see here at year 0, we have clear cut the trees, right? We've cleared them out. We have nothing but these stumps left. Now, that would be terrible if we just left it there, right? It would be like the Lorax harvesting all of the truffula trees and never planting them back. But we've learned what's important is we take the trees and then we regrow them. So we have seedlings planted, often in a very uniform structure, and we let them grow for about a period of 15 years. Then we go in and we remove the weak trees, right? Why do we do that? Well, because the weak trees are the ones that are probably going to die off anyway. They're not going to be able to keep up with the dominant trees that are trying to establish the canopy. So often these weak trees are just stealing nutrients and water from the trees that are growing fast. So what we go in is we thin the forest. This is called thinning or commercial thinning. We harvest those weak trees and we may send them onto the paper mill where they are used to make certain paper products or even mulch or something for gardens. Then in 25 or 30 years, we have these large dominant trees that have grown and pulled a lot of carbon out of the atmosphere, and they're ready for clear cut, and we go ahead and do this process over again. But there are different methods to how we remove the trees. So what we just demonstrated on the previous slide and what I'm showing you here is clear cutting. Clear cutting is easy because you just go in and you just remove all the trees, right, in one operation. So economically, it makes sense because it's easy to do and you get a good chunk of money out of it. But this has a high impact on the environment because it does increase soil erosion, which depletes your ability to grow trees and quality trees in the future, and it does destroy habitats. A better method is known as shelter wood logging, and basically what this is we remove the mature trees, right, in a couple of cuts. We've taken the large trees out, and that allows the trees to grow back with some of the canopy already in place, right? So we leave a few mature trees that provide shade, hence the name shelter wood. So the shade is important for the trees that are fast growing in the understory, right? They want to reach the height of the mature trees. So that helps in growing trees a little bit faster, and it helps with making them stronger. So we get a better product in the end. This has a moderate environmental impact because you can see there would be a fair amount of soil erosion. We're losing a lot of the canopy here, which would also decrease biodiversity. But it's more sustainable than clear cutting, and it does promote the natural regeneration of the forest, which is what we want. To maintain forest structure and promotes regeneration. Probably the most sustainable approach is to use what we call selective cutting or selective harvest. Basically, you're taking individual trees or small clumps of trees based off of their value. You might analyze the trees for their size and their ability to produce lumber. So this has the lowest environmental impact as it preserves the forest structure, it prevents soil erosion, and it maintains biodiversity throughout the forest. It's not as economic, meaning you're not going to make quick money off of this like you would with clear cutting. But if you think long term and sustainably, this will allow you to make a moderate amount of money and have a better product indefinitely. So you'd always be able to harvest trees year after year and produce a good product for the market. Let's finish up by talking a bit about forest fires here. And forest fires are interesting because they get a lot of press as being terrible, and they are scary events. And usually we're concerned about forest fires because people have built homes within forests. But forest fires are a natural process, and they're very important to forests. And this is why we call them forest fire cycles or fire regimes. Because forests are supposed to go through this natural disturbance process that clears the underbrush. It clears that understory, and that burnt vegetation puts more nutrients back into the soil and then promotes the regeneration of species that can handle the fire. We generally classify fires in three types. We have ground fires, surface fires, and crown fires. Now, ground and surface fires are like the natural burning of the understory. This can happen as a result of lightning or something. Is basically, if there's a dry area in the forest that gets struck by lightning and you get a little fire, and it kind of burns the understory, kind of clears it out, which kind of cleanses the forest and puts nutrients back into the soil, and then things can start to regrow. It tends not to lead to the death of the larger trees because they don't burn as much. Their bark may be scalped or singed from the fire, but overall the canopy is still existing. Where we have some problems is when these forests make it up to the crowns, up to the canopy. We call these crown fires. These are where we get really, really intense fires that decimate forests and destroy homes. So in an effort to avoid these larger forest fires, we have had a history of trying to suppress forest fires. And so suppression of forest fires has led to larger forest fires and more of a problem. So what we now try to do is we will try to mimic nature with these regenerative ground fires by doing what's called a controlled burn, which we also call prescribed fire. This is the intentional application of fire to the forest floor to burn out the understory, because we don't want this brush to continue to accumulate, because then it becomes like fuel for a larger forest fire. So if we intentionally burn out the understory, this serves as the natural cycle to control the undergrowth and add nutrients to the soil. So it helps to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires. So you can see this is being watched and managed by forest managers here. They are simply letting the underbrush burn out, and then they put the fire out. We have these here locally in the North Florida area. Every once in a while you may notice that it's smoky, or that there's a smell of smoke in the air, and this might be a prescribed fire being done in an area. So again, this is important for controlling those large forest fires that we can see that could cause damage to our homes, but also take out our precious forests. Okay, here is the practice MCQ. So go ahead and attempt to answer this. You can pause the video and read through all the selections. All right, so the sustainable use of forests in the United States would be encouraged by cutting small groups of medium and large sized trees in uneven aged forests, right? So this is the idea of selective harvest. That's what is being described there. So that's much more sustainable. Here is the FRQ. So pause the video and go ahead and attempt to answer the three parts of this FRQ here. All right, so part A, you were to identify two characteristics of a forest, right, that have developed when fires have been suppressed, and explain why fire suppression, increases the risk of forest fire. So here is your key for that. So any of these would be a characteristic of forests that have not been allowed to burn, right? So the accumulation of combustible materials or increase of the understory, right? So all of these are concerns there. And then explanation of why these things are a fire risk. Well, it adds fuel, right? So there's more things to burn. Or more ability for forest fires to spread. Okay, so that's basically how you would get those points. The second one, the second or part B of this, is looking at the positive effect and negative effect of removing medium and large trees, right? So basically a positive effect of removing trees would be economic growth, right? So we have some lumber provisioning factor, a provisioning service here providing lumber. But also increasing them will allow the understory to develop into larger trees. Again, additional timber made available. So all of these are good benefits. Now, negative effects is that it could reduce available habitat, right? It could allow timber companies to cut in areas remote from forest communities, right? And it could cause reduction in biodiversity, a number of other things, soil erosion. So all of these things that we kind of talked about, and a few additional things. Now, part C was to look at two ecosystem services and how they would be impacted by clear cutting. So probably a number one ecosystem service is that carbon is removed from the atmosphere by trees, right? And so when we clear cut, that carbon will be released back into the atmosphere, fueling climate change. Another one is forests provide oxygen via photosynthesis, so we could lose that production of oxygen. Forests provide food products, right? So if we take those trees out, well, that can change that availability. Forests provide wood, right? So whether it be for construction material or fuel, well, again, clear cutting, there's an increase short term, but long term, we lose that availability. So there's a number of things here. You can see if you wanted to go with a cultural service, right? We have the aesthetic value that's important for hiking and camping. Well, you lose that natural beauty. It's much more pleasant to walk through an old growth forest than a forest plantation. So that does it for this lecture on forestry. So make sure that you have submitted your notes and included any necessary diagrams.